Today on the SaaS Academy podcast, we've got one of my favorite people on the show, Adii Pienaar, serial entrepreneur, an author with multiple books, founder with multiple exits, and just honestly a great person to be around. He's also an e-commerce genius. So if you're running any type of business that does anything in e-com, you're going to want to watch this episode all the way through. I'm going to be quiet and get in this conversation because it's going to be awesome. So Adii, welcome to the podcast, man. It's great to have you.
Matt, thanks for having me.
I love it. So I'm going to just do a throwback, right? So we do a bunch of research before the podcasts, and I want to know the answer to one burning question. Who is Adii Rockstar?
Yeah, it is a throwback. The story is simply that my birth name is Adii Pienaar. So Afrikaans, very similar to Dutch, my first language, and I can't pronounce it in English because I have to roll my tongue differently. So when I started working online way back in the day, 2005, I started using a nickname from high school, which was just Adii. And crucially, as I started using that more and more, and I kind of built a bit of a brand around it, I went for the two I's because Nintendo Wii had just come out, and I figured this is the perfect way to differentiate.
So the nickname had one I to begin with.
Yeah, the nickname, I think the nickname just, like, nobody ever wrote it, right? Like my rugby playing buddies would call me Adii. So it was never written, but when I started writing it, I went double I, figured branding, etc., be memorable, was a purple cow, Seth Godin. And then for the longest times I started working in WordPress, I would just, at that stage it was cool to say you're a rock star at something. So it was just Adii with a tagline, WordPress Rockstar. And then eventually I felt that I wanted to kind of broaden my horizons a little bit beyond just WordPress. And I just dropped the WordPress altogether. I just went Adii Rockstar. For the longest reason, I used that instead of Adii Pienaar. I mean, I think, it was probably like 2011, 2012. So I was like, no, this is like kind of juvenile now. I can just be myself. I can just be Adii Pienaar, which is what I now use. So, but it was a fun time. I mean, even now, like all my taglines, I still say ex Rockstar, and people ask me like, were you in a rock band? I'm like, dude, I love music. I can't play a musical instrument at all.
But dude, it's funny because I think it's like, it shows your mindset, right? I think that you just like owned it. You just went all in on the Rockstar thing. It's just like a company, right? I mean,
that's the thing, right? Which is very, I think that's, very indicative of the time, and this is me reflecting in real time now. I think at that stage, there's some kind of, ignorance is bliss kind of mindset to it. You just do things. You don't think about the consequences or the bigger picture. I think, if I contrast that to where I'm at today, loads of experience, both life and business, one almost tends to overthink these things, right? Like, I don't know whether, if I'd never done that back then, whether I would pull off that now, right? Like, I'd find so many reasons to just not do it.
Yeah, Johnny says that all the time about entrepreneurship. He's always like, if there was a bottle and you could read the label on the bottle of what it's actually like, a lot of people wouldn't even do it.
No, exactly right.
Yeah.
I mean, and I've honestly, like, even though there's been, I think every entrepreneur would attest to the fact that it's a roller coaster, right? But even through all our ups and downs, like, it's been mostly a 15, 16, 17 journey of net success for me. Yet I kind of find that it becomes harder to some extent, right? Because it feels like I become more aware of the pitfalls, the challenges, the hardships. Whereas back then there was just youthful exuberance around it, just doing cool shit, and trying to make money off it.
So speaking of youthful exuberance, so if you're listening to this and you don't know, Adii has founded some companies that you've probably heard of. WooThemes and WooCommerce in the WordPress space are probably the most notable, I think, on a large scale. You started WooThemes in like 07, 08, and then WooCommerce was a fast follow in 2010. Like, how did you apply your youthful exuberance, right? Or to ask a better question, like, what got you started building the themes company and then the pivot into e-commerce? Like, what was going on back then in that area of time?
Yeah, I mean, themes was a consequence of, I wanted a blog, found WordPress, figured I can teach myself some PHP, self-taught, very limited programmer. Did that, and then I started realizing that the stuff that I was doing on WordPress, I could do those for clients. So whilst I was at varsity, I did some freelancing. And then I had this realization, I wasn't the only one. There were like 2 or 3 others in the space that started thinking along the same lines, which is, can we take these things that we're doing for customers in a once-off kind of manner on top of WordPress and kind of prioritize that, right? So that instead of kind of doing 1-to-1, you can do kind of your 1-to-more at the very least. And that really was the kind of the impetus for WooThemes. I think for me, the bigger picture there was always like, can I democratize the power of the platform to a broader audience of people at a lower cost, right? Essentially making it more accessible. And it's interesting because I can't, I mean, this is what I tell you now, right? That I think that the impetus or the seeds were there, but that is something that was, kind of very inherent in every business that I started. This idea of like, can I back the underdog? Like I also have a huge passion for SMBs versus actually selling into the enterprise for exactly that reason. Like in my mind, there'll be more people making, $100,000 a year than $100 million a year, right? Like that's just the kind of passion. But anyway, so that's how I got into kind of WordPress and the theming side of things. What ultimately happened for Woo was we found that the biggest growth category for us in themes was what we call business themes at that stage. So just different kind of businesses that want some kind of brochure-like website, like regardless of what industry they were in. And they kept asking us for a shopping cart. Like, hey, I just, like, those were the words. I remember it kind of vividly. Like, can I just add a shopping cart to my site? And at the time, there was no amazing e-commerce plugins available for WordPress at least. And we ultimately had 3 false starts. Trying to build it in-house, trying to partner with a WordPress core contributor, trying to partner with another WordPress core contributor. Because it was, even though WooCommerce today is such a vast, or vastly used plugin and platform, we weren't that great at engineering. Like we designed really beautiful products and we understood how they worked. But engineering, I wouldn't say like we were like 90th percentile kind of engineer. So we tried to partner, and it wasn't until we ultimately found 2 guys, Jay and Mike, that were building something else very similar for another company that, and we ultimately tried to acquire them. The company said no, because we lowballed them for an offer. That's part of the story that should be more evident here. But we persuaded Jay and Mike to come build for us. And they essentially took the beauty of open sources, they took what they'd built, and they built WooCommerce for us and became core kind of integral members of the team. What is also fascinating, at least there, and like I love telling this part, is we still figured that we would build WooCommerce because it would allow us to sell more themes. And Jay and Mike brought a model of selling kind of add-ons or extensions or little applets on top of WooCommerce. So core plugin for free, and then you sell these other things. And I remember it was about, I think 13, 14, 15 months, that WooCommerce, and especially those kind of extensions, those add-ons, became 90% of our business. So, I mean, yes, it kind of flew from a very strong base at that stage, but there was some luck involved. There was some, again, youthful exuberance in terms of saying like, we'll just go do this thing, and kind of the model will follow afterwards.
I love that, because I think a lot of the time it's when you have success, you have an exit, it's so tempting to go back and say, I had this master plan where I saw this huge, gap in the e-commerce market for SMBs, and we went and built this thing. And like, that's the real story, is the way you laid it out. It's like, we were selling themes, people asked for a shopping cart, we built a shopping cart, and we just kept doing stuff until it worked.
And I guess like the beauty of that, Matt, is that, I mean, it was completely bootstrapped. Like we had no agenda or requirement from kind of external investors, except what we wanted to do, right, as co-founders in the business, which meant that we could truly, I think you do 2 things, right? Like A, you stick to your values, and B, you follow your best customers, and you figure out like how can I make them more successful? How can I charge for that? Like all of those kind of your good things. We never consider things like, what is the total market for this? Or how do we need to get to the next fundraising round, or how are we ultimately going to sell this thing, right? Like none of those things, and maybe again, like that's also just youthful exuberance. I think in subsequent companies, I definitely put more thought into that. But at the time, like it really was just having fun and doing some cool things.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there were no good, emphasis on good. You mentioned there are no good WordPress-oriented e-commerce solutions in 2010. Like, who were the competitors? Who else was in the game? Was Shopify doing stuff? Who were you up against when you did this?
So Shopify was still early on. We actually did some work with Shopify. So some of our themes that ultimately worked for WooCommerce, we actually ported to Shopify as well. I mean, I think there's a whole fascinating thing in there as well where, because we came from the open source world, we always just felt that kind of a rising tide lifts all boats, right? Beyond Shopify, Magento was obviously there. I think the key though, and the reason even like the incumbents in the WordPress space, the reason we didn't go with them either was their templating language was limited. And the one thing that Woo stood for was we worked with some of the best designers at the time, web designers at the time, because we really wanted to design beautiful kind of websites and kind of interfaces. And we didn't think that we could do it with that. Magento was like extensive and very workable, but hard to maintain, hard to design for, etc. And Shopify was the new kid on the block that was just coming out of that kind of initial stint where they'd essentially built kind of, Toby and his co-founders had built Shopify to be just to power their own snowboard. I think it was a snowboard store or something like that, right? So they had just come out of that and started kind of opening up their ecosystem to other themes, to other apps, to start extending the kind of the core that they had built.
What would you do differently if you were back in 2010, step in the time machine and you're running WooCommerce now? Is there any product decisions you do differently or different ways to execute?
I mean, I guess the kind of, one of the challenges that, Woo still has to this day is due to it being a self-hosted, decentralized platform, you don't get the kind of data sharing. And it's not about just data sharing, but the economies of scales the virality that comes with it, right? So simple example there would be something like Shop Pay. Because it's a hosted platform, it's easy for them from an infrastructure kind of standpoint to roll that out, right? Which is why I think Shopify today is significantly more kind of a payments company first and a software company second, right? That's like thinking back, like that's still Woo's kind of your challenge. It was also a challenge back in 2010. I don't think that it's. I don't think there's an obvious answer to that.
Yeah.
My gut feel is that, people that picked WooCommerce back in the day had very specific reasons for doing so, and they probably still do that today. And I've often been asked in a world where Shopify is the biggest e-commerce platform in the world, WooCommerce is second in terms of volume. Some people argue about volume, but I think Shopify has the quality of merchants along with the volume that exceeds that of Woo. And people ask me like, is this just going to Shopify's going to winner takes all market? And I actually think that's not the case. I think, there's still reasons for people to want to work with an open source solution that they can self-host that works in a slightly kind of a different way.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I remember when I bought it, when I started using it, because I was already on WordPress and I didn't want to leave the ecosystem and do something else. So it looked like it was a component of my website, and that made sense to me. So I bought it.
Yes.
And that the reason, what prompted that question is I was thinking back on my own journey when I was a customer of yours, right? And like I think we implemented the shopping cart, and then I feel like I remember, you can fact check me, but I feel like I remember I was buying like a la carte features, I think, right? So I needed like a different type of checkout flow and what popped into my head is I don't remember you guys ever doing payment processing like inside of Woo, right? And so I think you spoke to that in the self-hosted versus managed thing.
And I mean, those were the very early days. I mean, I think in the various, like 20, I mean, this should be fact checked, but I don't think Stripe existed, for example. Like it was still really hard. I mean, I think the kind of in the early days, the payment processor, that extension that we sold that grossed most was authorized.net, right? And it was crappy to work with back then.
Yeah.
Like it's nothing, like payments was just hard. Like there were a lot of guardrails around it. So, I mean, I don't think, we when I ultimately left Woo in 2013, we had started contemplating how to build just a hosted version of Woo. But even then, like payments was not the thing, right?
Yeah.
Like I think to that extent, at least, like what Shopify have done, they were visionary, right? Yeah. Like somewhere along their journey, they saw that the way to best monetize this is through payments, and they went after it hard. And they, in payments, I wouldn't say they have a monopoly in terms of e-commerce, kind of payments, but ShopPay is a really compelling product, both for consumers and for merchants.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to compete against that today.
Yeah, and it's wild when you look at their financials, being a public company, it's like their merchant services line item is many times their software line. Now the gross margin's lower, but still, I mean, it's a big business unit doing all that stuff. It's pretty impressive.
Massive.
Yeah, it's wild. So you sold that. What year did you sell that?
So I stepped down as CEO in 2013, and I actually sold at that stage to Magnus Mark, my co-founders.
Mm-hmm.
So I sold out to them, partly because I had felt that I can't fully move on whilst this thing was still here.
Yeah.
And again, there's probably some youthful exuberance there as well. Hindsight, I could have probably moved on in terms of where my mental energy was without having to kind of cash out completely. And then Woo got acquired by Automatic, and I think it was May 2015. But at that stage, when I had no equity, I found out on the day that it was announced on TechCrunch.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
What are the big lessons there? That's an unconventional exit story that I'm learning some of this for the first time in this conversation. What's your pickups on that?
I mean, I think, hindsight is very much important here. My exit from Woo was tricky in that Magnus Mark and I fought for almost 2 years. And it's, I can't dispute the fact that frustration or anger or negative emotions also pushed me out, right?
Mm-hmm.
I let it push me out. And I think, I think that's important. That's the negative part of this. Because ultimately, jumping ahead, and again, I can only go and report the numbers. The value that I had sold for is vastly different to what Mag and Mark had sold for 15 months later.
Yeah.
Right? So a lot of chips kind of left on the table. I think the important part to it, the part that I wouldn't say just softened that, was the fact that the reason why I ultimately needed to leave was I had this thing at the back of my head saying Adii is a one-hit wonder. And I wanted to figure out whether I can take all these learnings and reapply and build another business. And I think that was ultimately much more important to me than an extra million or two, whatever the number would have been.
Sure.
From a kind of financial standpoint. Because otherwise, I think with Woo, I'm we definitely work hard. I think we made good decisions, we tried things, we were creative, all those things. I don't think our success is undeserved, but also feel kind of lucky, right? This was, first business straight out of varsity. It wasn't, I think, the extent of the success is massive, right? And even today, just to kind of try and quantify that success is my best cold kind of outreach email still starts with, "Hey Matt, I'm Adii, co-founder of WooCommerce," right? Even though I've not been involved in the company in 10, 11 years now, right? There's a lot of significance kind of to that. But as I said, because it's always felt that luck was a kind of big part therein, I needed to go do it again to tell myself that it was, yes, there's still luck. I still believe there was luck, but yes, there was also some parts of me that helped make that successful.
So, I talk with a lot of founders who've exited. A lot of them have exited one company, you've exited multiple. But there's a common theme in all of them, which is they leave their first company. We all have the same fear. I had the same fear, right? Yeah. It's was this all luck, or am I actually good or not, right? Or do I suck? But a lot of founders, they have this list of things where they say, now that I'm a repeat founder, here's this list of stuff I'm going to go do differently in my next company. So I'm curious. I'm sure you probably had that list. What were a couple of things from the list?
The funny one in hindsight, funny or ironic one in hindsight, was the first one on the list. Yes, I had that list, by the way. It's written down in a notebook. I still have a notebook as well. The first one on the list was, I will not have co-founders again.
Not going to have co-founders
again?
No,
not have co-founders. So, Conversio that came after that, I was solo founder. But that was mostly because I got burnt, and hindsight, there was just like, we were not proactive enough on aligning on values at the start of the journey, right? So we tried to do that much later on, but at that stage, like, we were such a big business, right? Like, it's just such a heavy subject. When you have an idea, then it's easier to, I think, to have those things. So that was on the list. What else did I have on the list? I had on the list, build a team sooner. Building a team, or at least that kind of executive level team or C-level team, was something we only got into much later, and I wish that we had done that sooner. And then one thing that was very prevalent that I worked a lot on going into Conversio was, and it's Jason Cohen, who's now runs WP Engine. I believe I heard it from him first, and he said, culture, like, every team has a culture, whether you do something about it or not, right? And I think with Woo, our culture kind of happened to us, and not that it was a bad culture, but big parts of the culture was also just we were young, boozy when we kind of hung out together, had fun. There's no real sense of like any concrete values that we were explicit enough about that would actually kind of create some kind of cohesion, right? So going into Conversio, I was very adamant that I wanted to nail what that culture was, and I wanted something that was more value-driven than this thing that just happened to us at Woo, even though parts of it obviously was very functional and great even, right? Like I've only good memories of the kind of the time building that company.
Yeah, there's parallels there between that and the whole talk track of first-time founder versus second-time founder, right? Is even if something great happens, it's different if it happens to you versus if you caused it to happen, with your actions. We had so Kevin Dorsey's like legendary sales trainer. He was at one of our board events, our last one. And he said one of his key values that he teaches every team he works with and every rep that he supervises is, even if you have great results, if you can't explain why you got them, like, I don't care, right? If you can't, if it's just an accident, it's not that helpful.
Exactly right. And even if, like, I'll take it a step further, even if you're able to do that, like, that in itself does not directly translate to you being able to do it again.
Yeah, repeatable,
the next time, right? Like, I think that the amount of clarity that you need around why it worked needs to be so in depth that you can actually kind of put that to work in a whole new context in future.
That's interesting. So WooThemes, WooCommerce, sold those. Conversio exited that company, right? Cogsy, so that's the third e-commerce startup. So I mean, when we say, you certainly have earned your stripes in e-commerce land. You've been in this game since the late 2000s. What's changed over the past 10 years in e-com? Like, where's the market going? If I'm new getting into the e-com game right now, how would you explain to me what's been happening?
I think the way I've always seen it, Matt, is that e-com has gone through a few phases. Initially, it was all around the platform itself and payments. Like, that was the big first phase of how do we make this more accessible. Then there was a second phase around everything marketing related, acquisition, right? The rise of kind of your Google ads, Facebook ads, Meta ads, really getting that dialed in, the kind of the Klaviyo-like tools that we built around email marketing automation. Like, that saw a big ramp up. Recently, I think the phase we're in is more operational. I think through all of that, it became much easier to start the e-commerce business. The product sourcing became much easier, whether you're, you're manufacturing in China or Asia and you're importing it wherever in the world. Like, that became more accessible and not just the drop shipping sensor of like really kind of your high quality products. So I think in all markets, geographically and kind of sectors, it's just more competitive, which means that there is a phase now where the kind of operational challenges or logistical challenges around this is more top of mind. But that has I suspect that has such a very physical constraint that I don't know whether we can whether software will actually change that.
What do you mean by that?
If you think about having to ship a container of goods from Asia to the States, anywhere, right? There's nothing software can do about that. It's just like there's there's certain physical laws around, like a container is just so big, right? And it needs to be on a ship, and the ship can only go that fast. Not much you can do around that, right? So I think that the constraints there, you're getting into real life constraints. So I suspect what actually happens there over time is consumer behavior is going to change again, right? Where venture capital can't subsidize the delivery of products where you don't make margin, right? Hence why we find so many direct-to-consumer brands that ultimately don't make it. They have this massive run-up, right? In recent years, I think the best publicized example was Casper, right? Like for every mattress they sold, they were actually losing $400 or something, right? Which is perfectly fine in the run-up, but then when investors lose their appetite to fund this, then there is no business left, right? So I actually think that I suspect, or my hope here always is that, as consumers, we move to being more conscious consumers, right? Where we actually don't demand, same day deliveries, right? Or free returns, right? Because, again, I'm bad at this, right? Like, I hate clothes shopping. So what do? I order same two pants, two different sizes. And they can deliver both of them to me, and I try them on at home, my convenience, and then I send one back, right? Yeah. But that creates so much cost and friction in the system. No software can solve that, at least. So I actually, acknowledging that if software can't change that, I think what is probably more interesting is how we start thinking about how our physical goods show up in our digital world and what that means, especially for younger generation, right? I'm not the target audience here probably, right? Yes, but I think that's interesting because the one thing that's also happened in the last couple of years is it's become harder to acquire a customer, both due to competition, but also due to kind of your privacy changes on multiple platforms, right? So the acquisition is slightly harder. So it's going to be interesting to see how, as I said, how our physical products show up in digital worlds and how that translation works, right? Because at some stage, it's fun to see a bottle of water in digital world, but then, hey, I actually want to drink the water, right? I think that there's something there. And maybe that's just the simplest example or just a concrete example of how I suspect the next frontier is around these new experiences that lead to new customer acquisition kind of channels and new ways of purchasing goods.
So I'm not an e-commerce specialist in any sense of the words. This might be a goofy question, but I'm thinking through what you're explaining just as simply a system with constraints, almost like a conveyor belt, so to speak. Do you see anything on the horizon that might change the manufacturing side? Like you talked a lot about having to traverse the globe on ships, right? Is there any way to empower more localized manufacturing for some of these goods and solve the problem that way?
I've always stayed away from any hardware stuff. I suspect, yes, there is something interesting there. It also just feels like China is miles ahead of any other country in the world in terms of manufacturing quality at the cost at which they can do it, right? Which again means that even if you were to make that shift, you somewhat probably need the consumer to say, hey, it's okay, I will buy something local even though it costs me more, right, than the important good. So I don't see, because there needs to be it's a bit of a chicken egg, right? Either consumers demand it or somebody subsidizes this in some way, whether it's a government, whether it's a kind of investor group, right? It's all possible, but someone needs to make the first move for that to change.
And it's a big bet. It's a big move to make.
Yes.
Yeah. How do you see some of the new technologies influencing consumer behavior, whether it's AI or augmented reality? I've seen some neat startups coming around. In fact, your example about buying 2 pairs of pants, seen one where there's an app that scans you and they're trying to minimize returns. What are some cool things you're seeing in the space around that?
I think the thing that I'm actually most curious about, Matt, that I think will kind of you play out beyond just commerce is that for years, if you have a look at kind of how our marketing has evolved, right? Like we've done certain things to essentially personalize it more for the person that we're marketing to, right? So typical kind of SaaS world would be, you click on a specific ad, you get a specific landing page that puts you into a specific sign-up flow. We ultimately segment you, like there's a behavior-driven kind of based on how you use the product, like all of those things, right? All of those things got us closer to personalization. I think kind of your next step, I don't think it's good enough yet or cost efficient enough yet, but with the LLMs, that goes into that kind of ratchets up again, right? Because you are now, in theory, able to send a personalized message to every customer every single time, right? So it's not just saying, send this, this default email, maybe with like a few kind of variables thrown in there to this segment fields. And this to that segment, right? Like that's dumb relative to what LLMs can do. So I'm curious to see how, like to what extent that essentially plays out, and like all of marketing is essentially one-to-one driven by AI versus more kind of cohorted or segmented approaches.
And it's funny when I think about that, because I still think it's changing a little bit, but it's still very text focused as far as the medium goes. Like I picture a world where I'm getting served ads for sunglasses and it's my picture with the sunglasses on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that far away.
Well, exactly right. Like image generation is probably there as well, right? Maybe not on identity, but yes, right? Like there are things there that will almost kind of start enmeshing itself to create a better product, right? Again, like taking e-commerce, like something that we've used for ages is, any brand that knows anything about you will start showing you products that you should buy based on whatever behavior you have, whether it's browsing or purchasing behavior, right?
Yeah.
But now you can imagine like doing that, adding the language part into it, adding some image generation into it where like you're also showing me the version of the image that you think will make me click the kind of your buy now button, right? Like it just becomes personalization to the nth degree in theory.
And with the privacy laws, at least, we're never going to know if it's working or not, right? We'll just keep trying it.
Well, like it's really you mentioned privacy. The other part, just the recent fascination, and part of I rejoined Automatic, Woo's parent company at the start of the year, to try a different path, and through that I've been energized to dive into the world of open source again. And I think like one thing that I've learned about open source is that it's a great counterweight to privacy concerns, right? And the best example I have here is currently with all these kind of AI or LLM wrappers that we're building, whatever service provider, software provider, they're sending it to OpenAI or someone else, right? And it's not very private and it goes into a black box, right? And you can't really check it. I mean, even with Apple's recent announcements around Apple Intelligence, I think that they're trying a lot with this kind of whole it's a private cloud compute that they're building, and they're trying to do as much as they can on device, right? But because it's closed source, you still need to trust them that they're not doing anything nefarious with the data, right? And I'm not suggesting people are malicious, but I think money does pervert, or the incentive is always there.
Yeah.
The temptation is always there to play in the gray areas, right? To come back, I think what is interesting is, in B2B SaaS, how much of that functionality will brands and businesses just want to self-host, right? Can I, for example, self-host? Fair enough, you're still hosting with Amazon, AWS, or Azure, or with Google, right? But I'm hosting my own LLM, open source LLM, with my own CRM, and I know exactly what's working and how that data is being used and being fed into the machine, right? So we're maybe moving away from cloud computing, and at least in terms of the centralized hosted manner, as a way beyond that, which also opens up, if you're using open source models there, that's the way to fine tune things, right? Like that's the way where you're not just relying on a kind of open AI kind of general model to provide value, but you're providing value for your specific business case.
Yeah, I've seen, recently Jason and DHH from Basecamp, right? They just launched a self-hosted, they're calling it once, right? Where it's saying, we're only charge you one time, buy the code, stand it up. It's made a big splash, honestly.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
The numbers probably, the reported numbers suggest that the model is probably more experimental at this stage than valuable. But yes, I think that there's an interesting part there, in that. Plus, I think what is interesting in that, I think it's Mark Andreessen from way back in the day, published an article. He's quoted in saying, we go through phases of bundling things and then unbundling them, and then we bundle them again in a new way, right? And I think maybe we're just in that little bit of a kind of unbundling. Also acknowledging, I think where once makes sense is, as once subscriptions got into the world of consumers, right, not just kind of B2B SaaS, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit of subscription fatigue, right?
Yeah, there definitely is.
So, again, just as a counterweight to that, is there a way in which I can just self-host this?
Yeah.
Right? Is there a way in which I can pay a lower annual license, for this to get updates, for example? I think there's my takeaway from that is just that I think that there is a little bit of kind of space there to be innovative in terms of how we build and sell software, in this next phase of the internet versus the way we've done it in the last 10 or 15 years.
So what I hear you telling me is that I'm going to buy Photoshop in a box for $1,000 on a CD-ROM again, right?
I mean, maybe in a box. I don't think CD-ROM is probably out of the question.
Ship is sailed, huh?
We don't have computers with kind of CD-ROMs anymore. I mean, I don't, at least. But yes, I think that there is some version of that could be true, just with a modern spin.
Yeah, that's cool. I'd love to switch gears for a minute and talk about team and culture and just this whole thing about working with other human beings, because it's complicated. I always say business would be so easy if it wasn't for all the people involved, but it's also the most important skill. And so, you talked about, obviously a somewhat complicated relationship with your co-founders in Woo, and then the first thing on your list of second-time founder, Adii, here's what I'm going to do different, was I want to be a solo founder. How did your viewpoint evolve? So did you stay a solo founder in Conversio? Were you a solo founder in Cogsy? Have you been a lone wolf all the way through, or has your viewpoint evolved since then?
No, so with my team at Conversio, I got very close to the team, and close in terms of relationships. And I'd say I had a core group of people that I trusted more so. One of them was Stefano, who was my first engineering hire, and eventually became our CTO. And he ultimately became our co-founder in Cogsy. But for one crucial reason, not just because of the fact that we had all this history of working together, but he and I also had a very high alignment in terms of our values. Yeah. Right? Both personal, but also in terms of how we would like to work together. And that was really helpful. And I think the key there was, as we were building Conversio, he was not afraid to say no to things when it wasn't according to our values. And that's hard sometimes, right? When I'm pushing forward and I'm saying, hey team, we're going to do that thing. And someone says, no.
Yeah. Can we talk about this, boss?
Yeah. Can we talk about values quick? This is very contradictory. That's very frustrating at times. But that refines that kind of understanding, that shared understanding of what values are and how it should influence decision making, right? Because values can't just be something that you put on a wall. It should be a living, breathing thing that informs things. And he was that custodian and confidant ultimately, that made me believe that he would be a great co-founder, which he was in Cogsy.
Do you have a story or an example the first time he checked you on values?
It was probably always around, taking shortcuts in making money. That's not something he stands for. Should be no shortcuts in terms of making money. But no, there's no beyond that. I'm speculating now. There's not a single story that pops up to mind or into mind in this moment.
That's cool. It's all good. I always like to ask because those are tenuous conversations sometimes. It's because it's such a, like, there's a set of conflicting emotions, right? Where you say on the one hand, your ego gets hurt because someone's kind of gut checking you on something that you wanted to do. And on the other hand, you know that they're right. And you're like, damn, like I'm going to have to eat my humble pie on this one, you know? So
yeah. Well, and I mean, I think the interesting thing there is like, and at least like if I, fast forward to that a little bit, is like probably one of the bigger things that Stefan and I had to work through was the immense seed round that we ultimately raised with Cogsy. I mean, it was at the height of the ZERP times.
Yeah.
Stupid money. That I say stupid money. It was market rate, but I mean, in hindsight, I mean, it was very, very rich, and we also got the term sheet within 4 days. Like first conversation to term sheet was 4 days.
Wow.
So everything had to happen very, very fast, and it's in that where like he and I suddenly had to do a lot of like back and forth and realigning on like what does this mean for the company, right?
Yeah.
Like because that suddenly changes from where we thought we were doing, like raise a bit of money, then push to profitability, which is what we did with Conversio, into this whole kind of new realm, right? So, but I think that the reason why we were able to do that is at that stage that, there's just so much structure around other values, because like values can also change, right? And I don't mean that to say like you can flip-flop, especially if it's opposite things that you're changing for. But I think values can be robust for a team, for individuals, for co-founders, so that it creates a space to have that conversation about how to evolve, right? Because I think it's very hard to, set some kind of value-based like operating agreement.
Yeah.
And you write it down and you agree it today, and then you expect that 10 years down the line, every single word of that's going to be true, because ultimately there's so many macro things that change, right?
Yeah.
That you can't account for. So you need to have that space, but the way you then make that decision of how, like, what will we change and how will we change that, I think that's important.
What makes a world-class company value?
That's a great question. I like probably two things, Matt. I think firstly, like the founding team needs to have like immense familiarity and conviction about it, right? Because I think that's the first part. Like if you're gonna be flimsy about it or flaky about it, right? That like it has no chance, right?
Yeah.
And then secondly, like the clarity and the context that the team can build about around those values, right? Becomes the kind of the part that really solidifies. That the more you can build that out, the more it becomes some kind of navigational system for every single decision. Because the more context, like you're always going to encounter a situation that might be totally unique from anything in the past, but if like it's like understanding physics, right? You know that the world works in this way. When you encounter something new, you can always draw it back to some of those first principles. And I think for a value like that's ultimately what's important. And probably the last thing I will say there is like, it needs to be something that I would say excites you, gets you passionate, like into the conviction part of it, right? Like, I think it's fine to say we're hardworking. Like, I mean, it's whatever,
Not
right?
that exciting.
No, it needs to be something that you can rally around, like something that is both kind of a North Star and a motivator on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis.
I heard this interesting quote, and I can't remember who said it, so I'm sorry if you watched this and you said it. But it was essentially saying that a great company value is only great if the opposite of the value could also be true. Right? So like your example, we're hardworking. You'd never see a company with a value that says we're lazy as shit. Yeah. We're not going to do anything, right? But like move fast and break things. Or it could be, build the world's most stable platform. If you're working in fintech or something like that, and it can't go down. So I think that's an interesting one of, it's a little bit polarizing, in respects where you've got to be able to say, I'm going to opt in for that, even though I could also opt in for the opposite of it if I wanted to work differently. Yeah. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, because that's where the conviction comes from. Like, if you think about entrepreneurship, like it is a choose your own adventure, right? And again, like if you have to pick something, like, and it also forces specifically not picking something else, right? Like that's the thing you're going to come back to and rally behind every single time.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I have one more question on the co-founder thing. It's like, this is, especially when I talk to early stage founders, it's a huge question. There's a lot of first time solo founders who are hacking on an idea, most of them non-technical. Maybe they've like hired a dev shop or something. Yeah. They're like, I really just want to find a co-founder. So you are kind of someone who I look at as like a visionary CEO founder who had a technical co-founder, right? But you're also a guy who went from I'm never having a co-founder again to someone who you speak very highly of. If you're in the shoes without the track record that you have, right, and you're looking for a co-founder and you don't know, like there's no Tinder for co-founder, you just swipe right on somebody. How the hell do you find that right person that you can build with?
I mean, I would firstly, by the way, say like, I now, if and when I start something new, I almost lean towards having a bigger co-founding team, right? I think there's probably a number which it becomes too big, but I believe that the diversity in skills and perspectives, I think, is important. So the way that I would probably do that, like if you don't have an obvious place to do that, is to build it organically within the team, and find those kind of early team members that can be a co-founder. And I think these things can be restated, right? Like, I think you can sometimes work with someone for a year and say, you know what, Matt, like it's been a wild ride. Like, I think you should become a co-founder in this thing, right? Because I mean, founder, co-founder, I mean, these are all just titles.
It's a title you assign, right? It means what you want it to mean.
Exactly, right? Like for me, it's more around the person you're going to be, the responsibilities you're going to take. And I think like having someone that's similarly obsessed, incentivized, invested in the thing that you're doing, that's not your wife or your partner, right? Like, it's so important that I wouldn't say take any dilution for that, but equity dilution should not be the thing that you're optimizing for there, right? I think this is the kind of I always like the way of thinking. Like, I think it's closely related to an African proverb, but it's if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Yeah. And I think it just helps. It really, really, really helps having someone or some people alongside you that, as I said, they have to share, they have to live, breathe, eat, sleep that business and the challenges, especially in the early stages, right? Because that's what you're doing. You're tackling the one challenge after the next. Yeah. And having someone else there is just easier. It becomes very lonely if you don't have that. So I think you can do that organically. Stefano did that. That was my experience. Like within Conversio, he never had the title or the equity for that matter to justify it. And he just had more of that, like, I'm going to act like an owner, right? And I should have probably, I could have, with this perspective now, I could have probably made that decision earlier to say, listen, you're like, let's figure this out. I shouldn't hold on to extra 5 or 10% equity here. Because that's always the question. And like, I wonder, had I done that sooner in Conversio's journey, whether it would have been a different outcome, for example.
It's interesting. I think people underestimate the performance difference that a properly incentivized person can have. And it's not to say that I don't think good people at least will deliberately sandbag. It's not what I'm saying. But I think that people have another gear. There's always another gear, right? There's always someone who can go faster, or be more efficient, or think differently about a problem. And like those things, the titles, the status, the equity, they really matter to people. And I think that sometimes as people who tend to found things, we can underestimate how important that stuff is to others,
Exactly. And I think the key there is probably like figuring out what is that unique incentive for every single person, right? Because some people, it might not be money, right? Especially it might not be equity. I definitely found that kind of equity is not always a great incentive for many people because it has such a long time horizon, right? Like figuring out how to instead pay that person a quarterly bonus or a quarterly profit share, for example, is significantly more motivating, right? But again, like I think that's part of the fun of building a team and building a culture, because you can build it around these foundational kind of things, and then find humans that can slot into that and just run with it.
Yeah. So you've talked a lot about building a team. It's the common theme through every story you've told just about. And another thing on your second time founder list was I'm going to lean into building a team earlier. What for you has been the biggest like differentiator in your ability to find A players, to find these people you want to go build with? How do you find them?
I think I'm inherently I find it easy to be vulnerable, which I believe makes it easy for me to show up in a very humble-ish, authentic manner. And I say humble-ish because, Adii Rockstar is not without ego, right? He's not without ego.
Right.
But I think like the way that I present, especially in one-on-one conversations, but in slightly broader capacity or broader context, is that more like there's some authenticity to it. There's some, humility to it. And I think what that helps do is, along with some tactical things about how to hire or how to attract, candidates, is the way you speak about the business is then more kind of your value driven, right? And I think it somewhat softens this, because these are just like, I don't think this is the only way of doing it, but in my world or my teams, like the financial outcomes of things weren't necessarily the number one kind of your outcome that we wanted to. Yes, it needed to be, a profitable, sustainable business, but it didn't necessarily need to be a unicorn, for example, right? And I think like what that means is, I think you can find great team members irrespective of the type of business you need to build. You just need to be very clear about the things that you're optimizing for, and to your point earlier, like what you're not optimizing for, right? Because the best people will self-select then. Like I think that's the key part there. If they self-select and you essentially give them that information to make the best decision for themselves, that's, I think, a much surer path to finding a great kind of team member in alignment that is in that kind of A player category. I think it's when you somewhat kind of want to obfuscate the kind of business you want to build, and or you hire someone on reputation that's not a fit, then I mean they might be a great human being but probably a better teammate on a different team.
That's interesting. So you said A players will self-select. So you're saying that you've got to be very forthcoming about what the business is and what it isn't, and like what it's like to work here?
I suspect that A players have a greater self-awareness about, at least around what their unique skills are, how they want to work, etc. Which means that it's my responsibility to give them as much information as possible to make that decision, because I don't think you can get to know someone in an interview process to that level, right? Like, I think that there are great leaders in terms of how they judge kind of your people. I think the better way is to have that be more collaborative and also give the other person enough information so that they can almost chase you, right? Or convince you or persuade you, whatever that is. But they're doing it because they have the information about what you're trying to do.
And that probably carries on. Like the way I'm assuming you run a culture is probably very transparent as well, yeah?
Completely. I think big believer in things like, I mean, we during hiring, like one of the things that we do, we specifically, and I've always done this, like I get you to like write a hell of a lot of things before we ever jump on a call, right? Because I want to make sure that how you write is of the standard that I expect of team members, right? Because that flows directly into the type of culture that I want to build, a way of working, which is more asynchronous, for example. But it also, like, all of those things lead into when you have a kind of a culture that's high on written communication, it also helps with things like transparency and like flattening of the org, and ultimately, having the information available to empower a whole team to make good decisions, right? Where there's no information arbitrage, where some C-level or 3 C-level kind of execs up there, they know what's going on, but the biggest, biggest part of the team, they have no sense of what's going on there, and they can't contribute, or they can't say, wait, hold on, maybe this is not the best decision because there's this thing over here, right? So yes, like, I think those values, like, they need to kind of infiltrate every single part of how you build a team in a business.
So I know this is a personal preference question, but I'm curious. You talked about leaning into writing and running an asynchronous team, like how does your ideal team work?
On their own. Like tactically, what I've done, so Woo was still hybrid in terms of part of the team had a small office in Cape Town, about 10 of us, and then by the time I left, we had about 30 or so people distributed all over the world. And that's actually somewhat harder. Like doing hybrid is harder because you always need to have that extra discipline of, if I walked over to your desk and we had a conversation, I need to remember, how do I float that up into kind of a broader context, right? Running a purely kind of remote or distributed team or purely co-located team, I think takes that away, right? Because you only need one discipline. You don't need some kind of your hybrid of those communication disciplines, right? So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing that we did, Matt, was I'm still a firm believer, especially in the early days, I think having some synchronous time together, even if you're distributed, is helpful, right? Like I think there is something to be said about, being able to have if I have an idea and I can shoot that off and like you're like, oh yes, Adii, like this is great, I like that and I like that, and have you thought about this? And like just that the serendipity that comes from synchronous conversations is important. So tactically what we always did was, based in Cape Town, so say Central European time, I tried to build a team around that time zone up until like East Coast time, because that meant like for most days, most normal work days, team members had about 3 or 4 hours of overlap in their kind of natural kind of work day. So I think that's important as well. But I think what you ultimately get to when you focus on being more asynchronous, you focus on writing really well, which means also documenting things really well, is you're ultimately building a more resilient and resilient org because you have redundancy in place. Right? If someone is sick, because you never, especially in small teams, right? If someone is sick and they're suddenly not around for 3 weeks, you better darn hope that they left breadcrumbs somewhere in different conversations that the rest of the team can pick things up. Like even if it's not specifically kind of documented, right? SOPs written, etc. Like, that's almost moot if there was this collective wisdom or knowledge that's at least there. Like, so for 2 or 3 weeks you were without that person, it might not be the easiest of times, but the business won't kind of keel over because that's not there. So anyway, that's personal preference, right? Like I think the key for me there has always been, I like to work that way, hence why I build my business that way. And like, that's why I say like, at least for me being an entrepreneur was never about, building the biggest business or making the most money. It was always about the sense of the freedom to build and live a life that that I dream about kind of living, right?
Yeah.
And there's trade-offs in that, right? I'm 100% sure if your dream is to ultimately IPO a business and be CEO of that business, that's a fantastic dream, right? But I'm sure that comes with a lot of extra requirements that might not be for everyone, or might require compromises elsewhere in how you design your life.
Did you find that leaning into writing brought out loneliness in the culture? Did you have to counteract that at all?
Yes, I think if everything is too asynchronous, it can become siloed as well. So one thing that we did, for example, is we would do team offsites or retreats twice a year. In person for a week at a time. The team, both Conversio and Cogsy, was small enough that if we went somewhere, we could still get like a big ass villa and all live together.
That's cool.
And an idea around that was always just like, can we, just live together for a week? We cook together, we eat together, we do activities together. We just like be normal together. And there's actually not the only worky thing that we did 2 work things normally on trips. Like one was having a bigger roundtable conversation. I think is better for strategic things. Is better in person because it's just easier if you can see someone around a table. Like there's little kind of your cues, like body language, where you can see like they want to say something that doesn't always translate well on Zoom. And sometimes we did a little kind of hackathon type kind of projects between teams just to have a little bit of fun. Not necessarily things that needed to be in production, at least. But the idea there of those kind of the week we spent together is really just about building out the relationship in person. Like I don't think being remote and distributed is not. You're definitely missing something if you're not spending any time in person together.
Yeah.
And it can't just be the 3 co-founders spend time in person. It needs to be the whole team. Otherwise, like the culture loses a little of that oomph that brings that cohesion, that collaboration, the creativity that I think is always important.
Yeah, no doubt. I love, and like for people listening, this is something I fully subscribe to as well, is not over-indexing on trying to cram in all the work when you do an offsite or get together. It's got to be about the human connection, I think, above all else.
Exactly. I mean, and especially, man, like it's so, it's almost counterintuitive, right? Like everyone has, like I think this is true for every human. Like we have our unique ways of working, including our workstations, right? So now we're suddenly like most of us have double screens or at least a bigger screen, right? Yeah. And now you're somewhere in a beautiful villa and you're sitting crouched on a kind of laptop. Yes, you can do some important work that's necessary, but you shouldn't be working kind of 8-hour days at that stage. Like it should just be about conversations, in my opinion.
I love it. So one of the things I admire about you is I feel like you're very clear on what you want and what you don't want out of life, right? Like you run a company a certain way because you don't want to run it a different way, even though you could have a certain kind of outcome. I love that. I feel like you know what you say yes to and what you say no to in a lot of situations. And I'd love to end our podcast talking about life profitability, because I feel like that's kind of the theme is I don't know, don't let me describe it. Like give the overview of what you're trying to convey in the book. I just think it's really fitting the way you've been talking on this.
The precursor for life profitability was something that I developed with my team at Conversio, where we described our culture as being life and family first. And the extra bit there, or expanded bit, was I think we said something like, we want to do stimulating, challenging, profitable work, but the most meaningful experiences that we can have are probably with people that are not our colleagues, right? I like on that note, like I really dislike this idea that like your colleagues are your family or also family. Like, it's like no, like we've got real families, right? Yeah. Like that's important. Anyway, so that was the precursor, and I think where that evolved to was this notion around like how do you build a business or a career that is life profitable, meaning the work you do should create the profits for your life, right? And the best quote that I could find, the most philosophical quote from Henry Thoreau, he says, the cost of anything in life is just life itself. And there's this notion that whenever we do something, whether it's like, concrete example, build a business, it's really hard to build a business. And alongside that, you are committing significant costs, which is often in terms of the compromise of the things you don't do in your life. And for me, at least, is for the longest time, I was very ignorant about those life costs that I incurred. And the first memory I have of this is, just in those kind of days that where Woo started thriving and Adii Jr. was born, and I think he was about 6 months old. I was not ready for the unpredictability of having a young baby in the house, even though I really wanted to be a dad. And my wife came to me and she said, you know what? You're managing your child like you would manage a team. And it stuck me, like hit me right here. And I was like, this can't be like this. And over time, like I think I developed more self-awareness, more clarity around what is important. And then you start tweaking things around, what needs to be true in the business so that you make fewer of these compromises. Because I don't think, I'm also not sure that there's some kind of utopia where you're not making any compromises anywhere. Yeah. But the idea there is that the whole idea about life profitability is, at least be clear about what those important parts are of your life, and then make sure that in the same way that you would have an investment portfolio that's hopefully diversified, make sure that you kind of invest the due resources or whatever it is in all of those things in some kind of timely manner, right? Maybe you can't do it on a daily basis. Some things also don't need to be on a daily basis, right? Like flying over here to Denver, hell of a long way from Cape Town. I don't need to come here on a monthly basis, but 2, 3, 4 times a year, I do need to spend time with peers. Yeah. Otherwise, my own life profitability is lacking, for example. So I think it's just the key there is like, there's no right or wrong answer. Figuring out what that kind of life portfolio looks like and making sure that the work we do is in support of that. I think that's the trick.
That's interesting.
Like, yeah.
How would you teach someone how to figure out their portfolio of life?
I think the easiest thing is to probably just cultivate this awareness around, what you're doing day to day, week to week at this stage. Where are you spending your time? Where are you spending your money? Like those things are normally good indicators of like what are like values or important things.
Yeah, your true priorities.
Yeah, true priorities, right? Because actions speak louder than words. And you might realize in some of those, like, well, I actually spend a lot of time on this thing and it's not that important. It's more of a grudge thing. And then the second layer to that is probably to think about energy, right? Like, what energizes versus what doesn't kind of, energize. And then I think the kind of the part that's, it's not in the book, it's more of a recent development on my part is, something that I've been working through in the last couple of months is, Maslow's hierarchy ends with self-fulfillment. And I think for any entrepreneur that sold a business, there's some version of self-fulfillment in there. And what I've actually found is that I'm yearning for more. And I couldn't find an answer. And then my current executive coach, she introduced work by the Blackfoot Nation, or from the Blackfoot Nation. So when Maslow was working with his hierarchy, he spent a lot of time with the Blackfoot kind of nation tribe in Canada. And their hierarchy works slightly different, which is the base level is the self-fulfillment, self-actualization. And then the next one is all about community actualization. And then the kind of the uppermost level is cultural perpetuity. And I think what I would add to life profitability at this stage is, I don't think, given the fact, let's take a step back, entrepreneurship is sometimes very much this solo player game. We're in this for ourselves. We're in this to kind of to craft this life profitable business even, right? To get rich, do work on what we want with who we want, etc. Yeah. Like many of these me or I things, and I suspect that often leads to some disconnection with our society, because ultimately you can be the richest person, and if the rest of the people around you, the people that often matter as well, like they're not there, it's just lonely.
Yeah. And
I don't think success or money fixes those things. So finding a way to, define those kind of the components for your own life profitability relative to others, and others will always have layers, right? Like start with family, friends, colleagues, etc. But I think there's a greater society to consider. But that's something that's very top of mind for me as I, kind of again iterate on my own version of life profitability at this stage.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's just like what we talked about with company values, right? If you're saying yes to something, you're saying no to something. Like there's an opportunity cost for every decision.
Yes.
And I love what you said about money in particular. Like Dan says this all the time: is money only solves money problems, right? Like you can have all the money in the world, you still could have a whole stack of problems to go along with it if you're not feeling the self-actualization. I love it, man. That's a great place to leave it. I appreciate your time on this. This was super fun. Where do people go for more Adii?
More Adii. In the past, I would have said Twitter or X. Not there. Adii.me. That's the blog. I'm trying to get into more blogging.
I love it.
And writing. So go there. If I publish anything else on any other platform, like that's probably where you find it as well.
Yeah. That's cool. I love it, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your genius with the world. Adii Pienaar, I appreciate it, man.
Thanks, man.
See ya.